You think life breaks you once, and then lets you go. But sometimes, it keeps breaking you again and again, until you don't even remember what it feels like to be whole. My story is not the kind of story people tell in the light. It belongs to the dark corners of memory, the ones you only open when your soul is too heavy to keep it inside anymore. If you're watching this, maybe you're curious. Maybe you're looking for answers. Or maybe, just maybe, you've been through your own kind of hell, and you're searching for someone who understands. Whatever brought you here, I'll ask you this. Stay with me until the end, because what happened to me will chill you, break you, and maybe even make you cry. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories people are too afraid to tell out loud, then give this channel a like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because here I'm going to lay bare the kind of truth that scars a soul forever. Pause. Sound of a deep inhale, her voice breaking slightly as she continues. I was 12 when my father abandoned me on the side of the road. Just 12. No suitcase, no goodbye, no explanation. He pulled me out of the cart, dropped me onto the dirt like I was nothing more than a burden, and rode away without looking back. I remember screaming, running after him barefoot, my little hands clawing at the air, begging him not to leave me. The dust from the wheels filled my mouth. My throat burned with tears. And still, he never turned back. That moment was the first death of my life. My father was supposed to protect me, but instead he left me to rot. And that night, I slept on the cold ground, with only the stars above me, and the shadows of strangers moving around me. That was the night I stopped being a child. Her voice trembles but grows sharper. The streets became my home, and the streets. Don't forgive. Men with hungry eyes saw me. Women with painted lips whispered to me, "You're too pretty to starve out here, little one," they said. And before I understood what was happening, I was dragged into a world of smoke, liquor, and neon lights. Clubs. Rooms with velvet curtains. Laughter that sounded like knives. Do you know what it feels like to be so desperate, so alone, that even the devil looks like a savior? That's how they got me. They told me I'd be safe. They told me I'd be fed. And for a while, I believed them. Until I realized that safety came with a price I never wanted to pay. Her hands tighten around her shawl. Voice cracks. I was no longer a girl. I was a product, sold, displayed, touched, broken, night after night. My body was not mine anymore. It was theirs. And every time I closed my eyes, I prayed to wake up from this nightmare. But the nightmare never ended. Years passed like that. I forgot what hope tasted like. My heart turned to stone. My soul? Shattered pieces no one bothered to collect. And then, one night, the door opened. I heard heavy footsteps. I smelled the familiar stench of tobacco mixed with sweat. My eyes lifted and froze. It was him, my father. The man who had abandoned me on the road years ago was now standing in front of me. Not as a father, not as a savior, but as a customer. Silence. The camera would linger here. Candlelight flickers, her wrinkled hands trembling, a tear sliding down. I cannot describe to you the way my heart stopped in that moment. The rage, the disbelief, the crushing weight of betrayal. Every nightmare of my childhood came flooding back. And there he was, the monster who gave me life, ready to destroy what little of it I had left. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I had lost my mind from all the years of pain and abuse. But no, it was him. His crooked nose, the scar above his brow, the way he clenched his jaw when he was angry. The same face I had begged to look back at me the day he abandoned me. And now, he looked at me like I was nothing but another body, another transaction. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the walls apart, to tear my own skin off, to disappear into the ground. But I couldn't move. My body had grown numb long ago. My soul had been forced to obey. And in that moment, the only thing alive in me was hatred. He didn't recognize me at first. How could he? The child he left on the road was gone. In her place stood a woman painted in makeup, draped in cheap fabric, wearing a mask of survival. I was unrecognizable, even to myself. But as he stepped closer, as the light from the lamp hit my face, his eyes flickered. I saw it, that moment of recognition. His pupils widened, his lips trembled, and then he froze. I waited for him to speak, to say my name, to fall on his knees and beg for forgiveness. But he didn't. He just stared, and the silence was louder than thunder. And then, do you know what he did? He smirked, a twisted, sick smirk that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't horrified. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't broken. He was amused. Amused that his little girl had become a thing for sale. Amused that fate had brought him to my door. And in that moment, I hated myself more than I hated him, because my body didn't run, my mouth didn't scream. I stood there, paralyzed, because years of pain had taught me one thing. Resistance was useless. But deep inside, something cracked open, something sharp, something dangerous. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Not with hope, not with love, but with revenge. That night he didn't touch me. He only looked, smirked, and whispered under his breath. "Life has a cruel sense of humor, doesn't it?" Then he left. But I knew he would come back. Men like him always come back. And when he did, I promised myself I would be ready. Her voice grows lower, her eyes glistening in the flicker of candlelight. The days that followed were torture. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every corner of the room, every shadow, every sound of heavy boots on the floor made my skin crawl, because I knew one of those footsteps would be his again. I remembered being 12, running barefoot on the dirt road, crying for him to stop. I remembered sleeping cold and hungry, waiting for him to return. I remembered whispering prayers to a God I thought had abandoned me. And now, the same man who had destroyed me once had come back, not to claim me as his daughter, but as his possession. Something inside me shattered that week, but in the breaking, I found a weapon. I began to plan. If he came back, I would not cry. I would not beg. I would not let him leave smirking again. No. If he came back, I would make him bleed. After he left that night, the world felt very small and very loud at once. The club's lamps throbbed against the windows like a pulse I could not quiet. Men laughed. Women moved like ghosts. And I sat on the edge of a cracked leather seat and watched my hands shake beneath the table. My hands had carried lard and bread and grime and grief for so long that I had stopped recognizing them. Now they trembled for a different reason. You must understand something about people like him. About men who can drop a child on the road without a backward step. They walk through life thinking their actions wash clean in the water of other people's apathy. They never imagine being looked at straight without flinching by the face they once owned. That is what I gave him that night. A look, not pleading, not begging, just a look that said, "Do you see what you made?" It lodges in the mind of a coward like a splinter he can't remove. I vowed I would not be a splinter. I would become a blade, or at the very least, a storm that tore the roof off whatever shelter he had built around his conscience. I started small. Information is the first kind of weapon. I learned their routines. Who came to the club? Which booths men favored? What names they used when they thought no one was listening. I listened less with my ears and more with my eyes. The way a man cradled his whiskey told me what kind of fear would unsettle him later. The way a woman smoothed her sari told me where small kindnesses might hide. I found a room above the club that a drunkard let me use as a sleeping place. It was small, smelled of beer and old cloth, but it was mine. In that room I began to collect what would be the ledger of my life. Names, places, dates, the faint descriptions of faces that haunt a person at night. I wrote them down on scraps, on the backs of bills, on napkins hidden inside a Bible I had picked up at a market stall. That book came to mean something to me. Not as a scripture of forgiveness, but as a ledger of truth. It takes a kind of cruel courage to walk through a town you know by sight and pretend you don't belong to it. I walked past the bakery where I had once stolen rolls. I passed the courtyard where men spat and exchanged news like smugglers exchange contraband. I learned which neighbor would pretend not to see me, and which would make a face and look away. Those faces taught me the kind of society that protects monsters, the kind that prefers a neat lie to a messy truth. I began to look for allies in unlikely places, not officers at first. Too many of them had laughed with my father, had taken his tea, had turned their heads. Instead, I found a woman who mended clothes behind the barber's shop. Her children had left town on fees she could not pay. She understood desperation better than most. She would sell me a button here, a patch there. Once, when a man in a suit followed me too close on a market lane, she walked between us carrying a tray and called him a name that made him blush and retreat. People like her are the small valves that let air into a suffocating room. Then there was a boy who worked as the club's errand runner. He was no older than 16, and his eyes had seen too much. One evening he fumbled a key into my hand, and then looked away, his jaw tight. He said nothing. That silence was all the permission I needed. He had seen what the men did in the back rooms. He had seen other girls vanish. He was tired of being the one who carried bottles to their hands. He needed to be brave in some new way. With the boy's help and the seamstress's quiet cooperation, I learned how to make small traps. Nothing cinematic. No strings across corridors, no homemade contraptions. Simple things. A folded pillow that muffled a scream to buy me seconds. A tear in a curtain that let a shaft of moonlight show footprints where none should be. A seat in the far corner where a man could be observed by 2 or 3 others who could be trusted to feel uncomfortable enough to say something later. These are not heroic acts the poets write about. They are practical measures. The kind that give you half a chance when fate tosses you into its mouth. I also learned cruelty. My own and theirs. I practiced speaking without tears. I practiced looking at them like a mirror that reflects back what they want to hide. There is a nasty sort of power in being unreadable. Men like my father expect submission. When they get composed defiance instead, they stagger. It is a small victory, but victories stack. They are the bricks of a wall you build so your enemies cannot see when you are digging a tunnel. During those months, my father did come back once or twice, like a bad weather forecast. Each time I carried myself like a woman who does not belong to his map. I watched him look for pity and find none. I watched the smirk slide off his mouth when he realized there were witnesses. When a waitress happened to pass and make eye contact with him in such a way that his boldness thinned to shame. He was a bully without a classroom. Take away the applause and the private rooms, and there is nothing left. There were nights where I almost stepped over a line, I thought of him sleeping, of his face as he had appeared that night. Terrified, small, human, under a thin layer of cowardice. I imagined 1,000 ways to make him pay. Exposure, ruin, a public unraveling while his neighbors pointed and said, "So that's the man." For a week I entertained visions of writing his name on the wall in the alley where the children play. So a child would learn his name and not trust it. Yet what I planned slowly changed. Revenge became less about spectacle and more about permanence. If I ruined him in the press, would that mend me? If I watched him wander a humiliated man, would my night stop echoing? I could not be sure. There is a cunning wisdom in pain that tells you when to strike and when to wait. My strikes needed to free me, not bind me to his downfall. So I continued my ledger, and I continued to build quiet alliances. I saved what little money I could from the handfuls men left on tables. I bought a small second-hand camera from a dishonest pawn shop owner who didn't ask questions. Later the images would help. I bought a burner phone and one of those cheap prepaid cards so I could call without tracks. I practiced telling my story in a voice that wouldn't choke when people asked the hard things. Because if I could tell it so others might hear and believe, then the tide might turn. The winter that followed was bitter. It turned men inward. It made them drink more. Their arrogance cooled in the cold air. They underestimated women warmed by necessity. I used the weather. Men came to the club in smaller numbers and with looser restraint. They took risks, seeking comfort. One of them, a cousin of my father's, who used to visit and clap him on the back, started to brag about a factory job he had in a nearby town. I wrote the name down. The boy who ran errands memorized the license plate of his car. These details, small as moth wings, would become the scaffolding for something big. Then, like a line drawn in sand, something shifted. A man who had been a quiet, watchful presence, the kind that sits with his head in his hands and pretends not to notice, came to me with a folded piece of paper. He did not meet my eyes. It was a map of the family's weekend plans, a list of who would be at which house, who would be alone in the back room. His fingers were stained from handling cigarette butts. He mouthed the only sentence I needed to hear. "I can't stand it any longer." That night my ledger grew heavy with names. Places where they took their own comfort, addresses where the men returned, the time the father left the house to go to the mosque, and would not be back until dusk. People think courage lives in one spectacular instant. Most of the time it lives in a million small choices. A conversation with a seamstress, a secret key slipped under a door, a boy deciding not to run when told to, a woman refusing to flinch. I realized my plan was not to make a show. My plan was to provide proof. Evidence is a stubborn animal. It travels, it bites, it informs officers who cannot be bought. Evidence is a kind of honesty that no amount of drinking can excuse away. So I stitched it together, slowly. Photographs, names written neatly on paper, testimonies from the few who had seen more than they dared say. I found a policeman not of my town, a man who had seen too much horror to be shocked easily. He had a scar over his eyebrow and a stoop from carrying grief. He did not promise me justice. He promised me to be present when the moment came. Presence is a kind of weapon, too. All this while I kept my face like a sealed window. I kept working, serving, smiling when customers expected it, so that no one would suspect the woman, with a ledger hidden inside the seams of her dress might be the same one they'd watched from the corner of their eye the night I finally decided the time had come was ordinary in every way. The lamps flickered. The rain had washed the streets to a gray gloss. A few men lingered in the doorway of the club, cigarette embers like dying stars. My father had left home early that evening. I had heard from the boy that he was going to the market, then to the mosque, then to a friend's house. I took a long breath and gathered my things. The seamstress had stitched a pocket in the lining of my jacket that would hold all I needed. The boy was at the back, ready to slip a message to an officer if a sudden change happened. The man who had given me the map sat at a table pretending not to notice me. The atmosphere was ordinary. Ordinary is the best disguise. I walked out of the club into the rain and toward a road that led where I needed to go. For months I had rehearsed this walk, the way my feet would carry me past familiar places, the way I would keep my head down. But this time my chin lifted. The city smelled of wet stone and an iron tang that made my throat close with expectation. And in that moment, with the ledger heavy against my ribs, I was not the broken child abandoned on a roadside. I was a woman who had learned how to turn silence into speech, how to turn shame into proof, how to make the kind of noise that could topple even a comfortable life. The road that night, it was slick with rain, black and gleaming like a mirror that wanted to show me everything I had been running from. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my teeth. My hands inside my coat were tight around that ledger, the camera, the pieces of truth I had carried like stones pressing against my ribs. I reached the house, my father's house. The windows glowed faint with lamplight, shadows shifting inside. I knew who would be there. The cousins, the friends, the men who had laughed while I cried as a child. The same faces I had collected in my ledger, like insects pinned under glass. I waited in the shadows across the street, and just as we planned, the boy slipped a message through a crack in the station wall. The officer came quietly, his step sure. He didn't look at me, not directly, but I felt his presence beside me like an anchor. That gave me strength, and then the door opened. My father stepped out, coat pulled over his shoulders, cigarette burning at the corner of his lips. He looked older now, weaker than the monster I had carried in my nightmares. But in his eyes, in those black bottomless eyes, I saw the same cruelty, the same emptiness. I stepped forward, out of the shadows. My shoes slapped the wet road. The lamplight caught my face, and for the first time since the night in the club, his eyes met mine. He froze. His cigarette trembled, ash falling into the puddle. He knew who I was. Not as a product. Not as a stranger, but as the daughter he had abandoned. His lips parted, ready to form words, excuses, lies, maybe even mockery again. But I cut him off. I pulled the ledger from my coat. Pages damp, ink smeared, but the names clear enough. And with a voice that did not shake, I said, "This is who you are. This is what you did. And tonight, the world will know." The officer stepped from the dock then, slow, deliberate. My father's face drained of color. He looked left, right, searching for someone to save him. But no one came. The cousins inside, already cornered. The boy had done his part. The seamstress too. The web was closed. "You think you buried me?" I told him, stepping closer, my voice low, raw. But I grew roots in the dark. And now, "I'm here to bury you." The officer put his hand on my shoulder, steady, grounding. Then he turned to my father. Words were spoken, rites were read. But all I remember is the sound of his breath quickening, the sound of his boots scraping against the wet stone as they pulled him forward, his body no longer powerful but small, trembling, pathetic. I didn't cry, not then, not when he cursed me, not when he spit in the mud at my feet, not even when they dragged him away and the house door slammed and the night went quiet again. I only cried later, alone. In that small room above the club, with the rain tapping the windows, I wept until I had nothing left. Because justice is never clean. It does not stitch back the years you lost. It does not take away the nights of hunger, the screams in the dark, the hands that broke you. It only leaves you standing in the ruins of what might have been, holding on to the truth like a shard of glass. But still, it was something. It was mine. And years later, now, as I sit here with these trembling hands, with a voice cracked by age and sorrow, I wonder, what did it all mean? Did I win? Did I lose? Or did I simply survive? I think survival is its own victory. Because every time I speak these words, every time I open these wounds to the world, I turn shame into strength. I turn silence into noise. And maybe, just maybe, someone listening tonight will find the courage to rise from their own ruins. That is why I tell you this. So that my pain is not just pain. So that my survival is not just survival, but a warning, a light, a story that will outlive even me. The candle beside her flickers low. Her wrinkled hands fold over each other. Her eyes close. A tear slips down her cheek. And with a whisper barely louder than the breath leaving her chest, she says, "Never. Let them take your voice.